talk about a subject that will be very important as we go through this class and really as you study the Bible and the Old Testament in particular, and that's understanding the value of the context of the ancient world to the study of the Bible. Whether you're studying the Old Testament or the New Testament, we're going to talk about the context from which those stories and the literature and the history that's taking place in the Bible emerged. Typically in the New Testament, we talk about that as the Greco-Roman context or the first century context. And in the Old Testament, we're most likely going to call this the ancient Near Eastern context. You might even see that abbreviated quite a bit as capital A, capital N, capital E. So if you see that in course materials or in reading, we're talking about the ancient Near Eastern context. When we talk about ancient Near Eastern context, we're talking about a variety of things. We could be talking about the social norms of the ancient Near East. What is it that people expected? What were the roles of men and women, parents and children, subjects and kings? We could be talking about something like agricultural methodologies and economies. What did most people do? What types of crops did they grow? What did they eat? Where did they live? Where did they shop? What kind of money did they have? We could also be talking about the stories that were told in those societies. And that's really what I want to focus on in this lecture. And that is, what is the role of understanding the other literature from the ancient world, and how does that intersect for us as we study the Old Testament? You might ask a question, why would we even care about other literature from other cultures that were also from the ancient Near East? I want to be really clear. I mean pagan cultures, cultures that don't accept that there is one true God, Yahweh, who has revealed himself to his covenant people, Israel. Why would we care what these people think? And let's start with this presupposition. These cultures are worshiping false gods. And so we're going to start there. We're going to affirm that. We're also going to affirm this, and that is the fact that the Old Testament is God's unique revelation of himself. So we're not looking at the ancient Near Eastern context, trying to understand how in the ancient Near East, the Bible is just somehow copied from other cultures. I want to be really clear, there's a lot of people who think that. There's a lot of people that their scholarly work has really focused around looking at other myths from the ancient Near East. So in other words, looking at the stories of other religions and saying, well, these just kind of are copied over time, and Israel puts their own spin on these things, and that's how we get at least a great many of the stories in the Bible. This is particularly true in a book like Genesis. I want to just make sure that we're aware of what these stories actually say. And then I want to talk about how they are valuable for understanding the Bible, and not just understanding the world of the Bible, but understanding the theological message of the Bible. Let me start by challenging something, and that is that the stories from other ancient Near Eastern cultures are very much like the stories that we read in the Bible. Let's look at one particular type of story from the ancient world, and that would be something that's often called chaos combat myths. The most famous example of this is Enuma Elish. You guys are going to watch a video on Enuma Elish and read a summary that I wrote of Enuma Elish in this unit. But the Enuma Elish isn't the only type of chaos combat myth. The Enuma Elish is the Babylonian version. In particular, it's more of a Neo-Babylonian version of a chaos combat myth, but we see the same thing in Akkadian culture with the myth of Anzu, or in Canaanite culture with Baal and Yam. Let me just kind of tell you how these stories tend to run. These stories tend to have a chief deity who is threatened in some way by a monster that either is a manifestation of chaos or rises up from the forces of chaos, typically out of the sea. And then there's going to be a hero deity, someone from the pantheon, who is going to come and somehow vanquish this monster and restore order, and in the process elevate themselves. I want to start here. That doesn't sound like the types of stories that we read in the Bible, does it? Especially not the book of Genesis. You see, in these stories, especially in a story like Enuma Elish, these types of stories also are involved in the stories that these cultures would tell about how the world was created. Let me just tell you how Enuma Elish runs. In Enuma Elish, there is a chaos monster named Tiamat. Tiamat's one of the gods. In fact, she has in a lot of ways served as like the mother of the gods. She had been married to Apsu. Apsu was the embodiment of the chaos waters. And what happens is that Apsu decides that he is going to kill the other gods, his children, because they annoy him. One of his sons named Mumu is going to help him do this. But the god Ea finds out about it and is going to kill his father Apsu before he can carry out this judgment. And so now Ea is elevated to be the chief of the gods. Tiamat is very offended by this. And Tiamat, who is herself described as a sea monster, who's like this dragon figure who rises up from the sea, decides that she is going to do battle against Ea and the rest of the gods to take vengeance on account of her dead husband and avenge his death and destroy Ea and the other gods who have allied with him. Ea is very scared of Tiamat, and Ea himself goes into silence. What's going to happen is that the god Marduk is going to rise up, do battle with Tiamat, defeat Tiamat, and then we're going to be told that from the remains of Tiamat, Marduk is going to shape the world. He doesn't create the world, but he shapes it literally from Tiamat's remains. Remember, Tiamat was a water dragon, a chaos monster, but also herself somehow symbolizing the chaos of the seas. So it's said that what happens is Marduk splits her into two pieces, the bottom half becoming the waters below the earth, the top half becoming the waters above the earth. And then to fashion servants for himself and the other gods, Marduk is going to take Kingu, the one that had allied himself with Tiamat. He is going to kill him, and from his blood, he is going to make humanity to be servants of the gods. Pause there for a moment. That's not at all what we read in Genesis. So it's pretty common. In fact, I get to speak to a lot of college groups about the Old Testament. And a lot of times I have students come up to me after the session, after I speak, and they'll ask me, they'll say, well, listen, I've been taking a class on the Bible as literature at a local college, and my professor said, well, Genesis is really just like Enuma Elish. And I always ask them, well, have you read Enuma Elish? And then I tell them what Enuma Elish is, and I told them what I just told you, and they say, well, that's not like Genesis at all. It's not. There's some similarities in the way that ancient people see the world. This is one of the important parts and one of the reasons that we would care about the ancient Near Eastern context. What we do see is that the people who told the story of Enuma Elish believe that there are waters below the earth and waters over the earth. Well, that is similar to what we see in Genesis. We could say that they have the same type of cosmology, meaning how the world is shaped, but they don't have the same theology for why the world comes to be. And by the way, we'll talk more about that when we get to the book of Genesis. So why would we care? If these stories are not the same as the Bible, if they're pagan stories that aren't telling us about the one true God, why would we even care about these stories at all? Well, here's why we would care about them. I told you, Enuma Elish isn't the only story like this. We actually have throughout the ancient Near East a lot of stories where we kind of have the same things happening. Here's two other examples. So in Akkadian literature, we're told about the myth of Anzu. In Anzu, the chief deity's name is Enlil. Enlil is going to have the Tablet of Destinies, which allow him to rule over all the natural elements and over all of nature, stolen by Anzu, who is also a chaos monster. Anzu's going to take the Tablet of Destinies, and so the world is flung into chaos. So like we saw in Enuma Elish, we have a problem where the chaos monster is causing chaos and disrupting any type of order in the world. And like we saw in Enuma Elish, the chief god, in this case Enlil, is scared and he is silent and he refuses to engage Anzu. And so in this case we have Ninurta, who is going to be the hero deity who rises up and defeats Anzu. He's going to do so in kind of a cunning way. Anzu, because he controls the Tablet of Destiny, can basically control the elements. So what's going to happen is that Ninurta is going to steal one of Anzu's feather, attach it to an arrow whenever Anzu causes the wind to blow so he can get his feather back. He fires the arrow, and of course this is what kills Anzu. At that point, Ninurta, like Marduk and Enuma Elish, is elevated to be the hero deity, an object of worship. In Canaanite literature, we have something similar happen with Baal and Yam. Baal's very familiar for us because we hear about Baalism in the Old Testament. And this is a story about Baal. Baal is said in this case to fight Yam. Yam means sea. And again, like in Enuma Elish, this is a representative of a deity or of a chaos monster that rises up from the sea. The chief deity in this case is El. And El once again cowers before the forces of chaos. But Baal is going to come and is going to fight Yam with clubs that he's given by Kothar Vakasis, one of the other gods. And he's going to defeat Yam and subdue the forces of chaos, and there's going to be order. And then we're going to hear about Baal creating his temple and his palace, and this again becomes a creation narrative. Well, why would we go through these stories? I actually want us to see one of the chief things that makes the ancient Near Eastern context important for us as we look at the theological message of the Bible. Notice some things that the Bible makes very clear. In all of these cases, the chief deity cowers before the forces of chaos. Now, in the Bible, how does God overcome chaos? Remember, by the way, the Spirit of the Lord is hovering over the face of the waters in Genesis chapter 1. And we read that, and it might seem confusing to us, but people in the ancient world, this is where this gets important. Do you see how because these are the types of stories that are told, they say, oh, the waters, this is chaos. How is God going to overcome it? Well, he doesn't have to fight the waters. What does he just do? By the power of his voice, he begins to speak. And the chaos of the waters conform to the will of God as he speaks the world into existence. So we see this theological message that in a world where people thought that the gods had to fight chaos and somehow violently overcome it, instead what we have is God speaking, and all of a sudden the world is ordered in the way that the world should be ordered. He speaks and his will happens. There doesn't have to be this violent combat. In other words, in all the other stories, there's a question about who's in control, but not in the stories that we read in the Bible. The true God has absolute authority. And so whenever we start thinking about, well, what made Israel different from the cultures around them, it's not just that their God is real and the other gods aren't. It's that as they start telling their stories, all these other cultures are going to be like, well, man, that's way better than our God, who had to somehow, gain power in the same way that human kings gain power. Another thing that I want us to see is that sometimes in the Bible, there's visions that God gives his people in such a way that as these visions unfold, they're going to see the glory of our God, the glory of the God who is in covenant with Israel and covenant with us through Christ, and how much better God is than the God of the ancient Near Eastern myths. Daniel 7 is an example of this. Remember in Daniel 7, there's these beasts that keep rising up from the sea. Now, we hear that, and we might think about other things, but they heard that, and they thought about Enuma Elish, or Baal and Yam, or the myth of Anzu, or other stories from the chaos combat genre, where they said, yeah, that's where the bad guys come from, is from the sea. So how is God going to deal with them? Is he going to come and do battle? No. He's going to come, and as these beasts mock him, what's going to happen is that he is going to judge them and put them to death, and especially put the final beast that rises up with the mocking horn to death. And then the one like the Son of Man is going to be given dominion. Well, Marduk and Ninurta and Baal and the other myths, they got dominion because they fought the other gods, but that's not why the Son of Man has dominion. He has dominion because the Ancient of Days gives him the dominion over the peoples of the earth and over every kingdom and tribe. And so what we have here is we see by contrast, when we understand the ancient Near Eastern context, we see the contrast which helps us see the point that the Bible is making here. So God gives Daniel this vision in such a way where it provides this contrast with his world, so that all of a sudden we can say, oh my goodness, this is what's happening. This vision is emphasizing God's sovereignty over all the earth, because look at how much different and how much better this story is than the stories that were told in the ancient Near East. So I hope that you guys see why we would talk about ancient Near Eastern background. It's not because we're trying to emphasize that it's the same. There are some similarities, things like worldview, cultural expectations, gender roles. All of that is often shared between Israel and her neighbors. But what's not shared is the theology behind the story. One last point of emphasis, especially as we move into talking about the Pentateuch and talking about Genesis. And that last point of emphasis is to think about the difference in what it means about the value of humanity in the ancient Near Eastern stories, all of whom, by the way, see the creation of humanity to be creating slaves for the gods. And we can see how, if that's your theology, humanity exists to be the slaves of the gods, well, that also informs your anthropology. And that's one of the reasons that you're going to have cultures where if a king can gain enough power, he's going to make people his slaves. Well, that's your theology. We're the slaves of the gods because they're better than us. If we can be better than others, why shouldn't we make them our slaves? And that's the anthropology that you get, the value of human life that you get in the ancient Near East. How very different is it that in Genesis, God says that he makes man not to be his slaves, not to make up for something that he lacks, but the God who has all power instead makes humanity in his image. We'll talk more about what that means. But that not only changes the way that we see ourselves in relation to God, but also changes the way that we see ourselves in relation one to another. If we understand the ancient Near Eastern context, it helps us understand not just the comparisons, but also the points of contrast between the ancient Near Eastern culture and their broader theology and worldview, and the worldview that is revealed by grace as the triune God enters into relationship in Israel, and we see that story unfold in the Old Testament text. So I just say all this to help you understand this is why we're going to talk about ancient Near Eastern context. Hey, if you're interested in this, let me just recommend 2 books to you. One would be just some source material. This is a book by Bill Arnold and Brian Beyer. It's called Readings in the Ancient Near East, or Readings from the Ancient Near East. If you just find these stories interesting and you'd like to learn more about them, and especially stories that are relevant to the Old Testament, that's a great work. And then if you're thinking more about, well, how could this help me understand the Bible, I would recommend Ancient Near Eastern Thought in the Old Testament. This is by John Walton. I don't agree with Walton on a great many things, but I do think he does a good job helping us understand some of the big picture things of how ancient Near Eastern context helps us understand the Old Testament. If you guys have any questions about this, make sure you're reaching out to your professor. We want to answer these questions, and be on the lookout as we go through class about different ways we're going to see of how the the ancient Near Eastern context helps us understand the Old Testament, not just in its cultural background, but in its theological message.